Excellent. So the book of Ovadiah, which comes from the word Eved, servant, and Yah, God, God's servant, often said in English Obadiah, which becomes, a very common name. I don't know how common, but a name in English, is the shortest book in the entire Tanakh. It is only 21 verses. Now, it is a powerful, beautiful book. There's a lot of strong messages and themes there. And in fact, we see two of the most common tropes in the entire Tanakh, particularly in the book of Edom. One is the trope of sibling rivalry. Is the prophet Ovadiah is railing against the nation of Edom. Who is Edom? They're the descendants of Esau, who was the brother of Yaakov. So Yaakov and Esau were brothers. They had a sibling rivalry, and their descendants are still fighting each other. So that's a common trope, and we see this a lot. Is the people who can hurt us the most are the people who are closest to us. And when we see a lot of world conflicts, while there certainly are conflicts between far off nations, oftentimes the people who really hate each other the most are the ones who live next to each other. If you look at the history of genocide or ethnic cleansing, you see too many examples, particularly in recent history, where someone's neighbors who there's literally nothing different from them, looking like Rwanda, where there's nothing different other than the shape and the size of their nose. There's no difference other than that and some made up history, and they still try and kill each other. So we see that there's something about being so close to somebody that creates this sort of imagined threat. But the other very common trope here is betrayal. And again, this is something that unfortunately happens very commonly within families. We see this with Amalek, who again had a connection historically to our people, and they stabbed us in the back. And the historical context of Ovadiah is this is after the destruction of the first temple, when the Babylonians came in and destroyed the southern kingdom of Israel, destroyed the temple, and now the remaining Jews in the land of Israel were weak. And Edom, our historical neighbors, who we had a familiar connection with, what did they do? Did they support us, raise us up? No, they attacked us. So you can understand the deep anger of Ovadiah and the other prophets who saw this. These are family. These are people we share something deep with. And we are at the weakest point we've been in our history, and they're attacking us when we are below even being down. That is the emotional power behind Ovadiah's speech. And if you read the verses, you'll see just the anger just coming out, and you can understand where he's coming from. But what we're really going to explore tonight is a specific question that will lead to a powerful lesson. We're going to look at the commentary of Dan Yitzchak Abravanel, who is an incredible rabbi, statesman. He's kind of a Renaissance man, as it were, for a rabbi. And one of the questions he's going to ask is, what's so special about Ovadiah? Because this exact same prophecy, not word for word, but basically the same thing as in the book of Yirmiyahu. So the rabbis tell us that they only pick books of prophets that have something unique to teach. Because there's hundreds of books out there that have similar prophecies. They're lovely, but if somebody already covered it, we're not going to retread the same ground. So what does Ovadiah add to the conversation? And we're going to try and explore that and see what Ovadiah adds that Yirmiyahu did not. So Tamar, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And while Tamar is unmuted, are there any questions before we jump in to our sources? Excellent. So tomorrow I'll have you read the first source, and this one is just to kind of, set the stage, and then I'll have you read the second source as well. But this is the very beginning of the book of Ovadiah. Again, just this is how it begins. Chazon Ovadiah, please.
The prophecy of Obadiah. We have received tidings from the Lord, and an envoy has been sent out among the nations. Up, let us rise up against her for battle. Thus said my Lord God concerning Edom.
Excellent. So again, this is after a battle, and the Edom has betrayed us, and that's the way he introduces his whole prophecy. And pretty much all the next commentaries are all really just on the very first verse, setting the stage and the theme. So this source number 2 here, tomorrow I'll have you read as well, is Ovadiah kind of giving you a summary of the theme of the entire book. So it's a great place to start to get us all really on the same page. So tomorrow, please, source number 2 from a Bravanel or a Barbanel, different ways to pronounce it.
The overarching theme of this prophecy is to tell about the future destruction of Edom and to explain that this nation, which is called Edom, started as a small nation and afterwards became rulers of the world. And that in the past, this nation already experienced many troubles, but not a total destruction. But in the days of the ingathering of the exiles, it will be destroyed and devastated completely and utterly because of its wickedness, and it did because of its wickedness that it did to Israel during the time of the destruction of the first temple and the second temple, and as a result of decrees that they decreed against the Jewish people throughout their rule over them during the exile. And that Israel will return and rule over their lands and their governments and in all the cities in the Negev, and God will be the one ruler, as it explains in the Psukim.
Exactly, in the verses. Now, again, as I said earlier, basically this summary is the prophecy not only in the book of Ovadiah, but also in the book of Yirmiyahu. I don't remember the exact chapter, maybe 46 or something like that. But again, this is a very consistent message, which is a nation that became very mighty, but because of their wickedness, ultimately they would fall. Now, one interesting thing he says is, they haven't fallen yet, they will fall in the future. And this is often a theological challenge for us. When we see a nation that's doing so many terrible things, yet they're still ascendant. Maybe a little bad thing happens to here, but they try to wipe us out, betray us, and for a couple of years, their stock market drops. That's really retribution from God, but we believe at the end of times, they will finally get their comeuppance, as it were. And as we had discussed earlier before we really started the class, is the name of Edom, is very similar in Hebrew to the word Adam, man. And perhaps there's this universal implication here that all human beings, all man that ultimately is wicked, ultimately their end will be destruction. And you may not see that in this world. You may not see it till the end of time, but we really believe that wicked people in the end will get wiped out. And one important thing to note is historically, we're still here. The Jewish people have suffered beyond calculation, but we're still here. But all these nations, from the Ahasuerus and Antiochus and the Greeks and the Romans and all the nations that the Nazis, everybody that tried to destroy us, that hurt us deeply, they're all gone. They're all gone. Some of them, maybe there's little inklings here, but we have survived them all because we've struggled, or we've connected ourselves not to wickedness, but to something greater that's worth surviving for. So there really is a powerful universal message. But again, other prophets have said it. So that leads, and Gloria and Leonard, I will unmute you. That leads to the question Abravanel asks. And just a statement about Abravanel's structure is, besides typical beautiful commentary, he often asks a bunch of questions at the beginning of the study of any book. And sometimes he's able to answer them all, sometimes not, but it's just kind of a cool learning pedagogical technique. Or here are the questions that we should explore as we go through the book. So of his, I believe, 6 questions, this is the third one. Gloria, please, from Abravanel.
The third question is, what does this short prophecy of Ovadiah add to the lengthy prophecies about Edom in the book of Jeremiah? Chazal have already taught us that there is no case where 2 prophets give nevuah in the same style.
And nevuah is just prophecy.
So we also need to know which prophet, Ovadiah or Jeremiah, came first chronologically, and what was the need for both these prophets to share about the same topic. If Hashem wanted to reveal his secrets to Ovadiah, why did he do so about Edom and not a different nation?
That's a great question. And that's perhaps Abravanel, who had the Talmud and rabbinic literature, maybe was kind of hinting at what he thinks the answer is. But this is a great moment to take a step back and say, what do we know about Ovadiah? And the answer is not that much, because when one studies the prophets, the Nevi'im, the only thing that we can, at least from the perspective of the text, the only thing we can be certain about them is what the books they wrote say about them. And oftentimes, for those who remember, a lot of the prophets, the books of the prophets, don't tell us much about the authors. They don't tell us the when. Sometimes we get a hint or a name of their father, but they often don't talk a lot about themselves because they're humble. They're not what matters. It's the people that they're prophesying to. Now, there are a bunch of men throughout the Torah who are named Ovadiah. And the question is, are they all the same person? Now, some of them existed hundreds of years earlier or later, so they obviously can't be. But what the rabbis often do is they conflate people in the Torah. Sometimes there's no question that two different people mentioned somewhere in the Tanakh are the same person. That a prophet mentioned in this book is definitely the one over here. But a lot of times we don't know. So there are a number of stories about Ovadiah that might be about the author of this book, and they might be about a totally different person because this was a fairly common name, or certainly others had it. But one of the questions he asks here is, who wrote the prophecy first? Because if Yirmiyahu wrote it first, then Ovadiah is just copying him. And if Ovadiah wrote it first, then why did Yirmiyahu need to copy it? And what's interesting is we don't know. We know that they're obviously writing around the same time, around similar events. We don't actually know who came first. And the printed order in the Torah, the printed order has nothing to do with chronology. People might assume that, but it's absolutely, there's no basis for that the prophets are printed in the order of when they were prophesying. It's unclear exactly why they were put in a particular order, whether it was length, what they were prophesying. There's a lot of different reasons. Now, one hypothesis is that both Ovadiah and Yirmiyahu, with very similar prophecies, were both learning from someone else. And this is not, a heretical they're copying. We know that the prophets were familiar with each other, and they were inspired by the words and used the poetry to spread their mission and their vision. But it seems that Ovadiah and Yirmiyahu were probably both quoting from another earlier prophet. But even if that's true, why would the rabbis then choose to put them both in? The rabbis could have said, obviously, these guys are saying the same thing. Yirmiyahu's way bigger and says a lot more. So sorry, Ovadiah, you go in the B pile. But they included him. And again, it's crazy short. You already covered this in a chapter of Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu. Why do you need an entire book that's one chapter? And the answer to that comes into the title of this entire class, which is Ovadiah, the courageous convert. We have a tradition that he's a convert. Well, what nation did he come from? And that brings us to our second section about his conversion and why it was so important that we included specifically his prophecy about Edom. So any questions before Leonard reads this next source? Pause for a moment. Excellent. So Leonard, if you will please read this source from the Talmud that really tries to tackle this question about what's so special about Ovadiah, please.
The verse states, the vision of Ovadiah. So says the Lord God concerning Edom. We have heard a message from the Lord, and an ambassador is sent among the nations. Arise, and let us rise up against her in battle. Obadiah 1. The Gemara asks, what is different? That is, what is the reason that specifically Obadiah prophesied concerning Edom? Rabbi Yitzchak says, the Holy One, blessed be he, said, let Obadiah come, who dwells among two wicked ones, Ahab and Jezebel, but did not learn from their actions. And he will prophesy concerning Esau, the wicked, and the progenitor of Edom, who dwelled among two righteous ones, Isaac and Rebekah, but did not learn from their actions. Ephraim Mikshah, a student of Rabbi Meir, said in the name of Rabbi Meir, Obadiah was an Edomite convert. Consequently, he prophesied with regard to Edom, and this is, as people say, from and within the forest comes the axe to it, as the handle for the axe that chops the tree is from the forest itself.
Excellent, thank you. So the rabbis are saying there's two things that are unique about Ovadiah. One is that certainly when he was an Israelite, he was living amongst these evil rulers, Achav and Izebel, who was not a Jew. She was an idolatress who helped corrupt Achav, who let himself be corrupted. But somehow, even despite being surrounded by so much wickedness, he came out being a righteous person. So that shows incredible strength. But that's not really the key here. The uniqueness, and again, this is a rabbinic tradition, but it might help explain why the rabbis chose Ovadiah, is because they had a tradition that he was a convert from being of the nation of Edom. He was an Edomite. He was a member of that betraying evil nation who were related to us, but they were evil. And somehow he was able to overcome that wickedness. And then once he became an Israelite, he turned around, now having learned from them, understanding them, and knowing their weaknesses. And this image here is so powerful. From the forest comes the axe. The forest here is corrupt. It needs to be destroyed. It needs to be cut down because it's corruption. The fungus that is destroying the rest of the land will take over the whole world. Well, one of those trees somehow was immune to this corruption. And it turned and someone used it and they made an axe. And that axe is now from that very forest was able to survive the corruption and will now go back and destroy the corruption. So I just want to sit in that image for a moment because it's so powerful. Is what right did Ovadiah have to be the unique one to prophesy about Edom? Because he was an Edomite. And he overcame the evil of Edom. Nobody understood their evil, their arrogance, how they were up in there's an image in the psukim, in the verses about them being in the clefts of the rocks, looking down on everybody else. Those who betray others think they're better than them, think they're above honesty, think they're above treating others with respect. Nobody understood that better than Ovadiah himself. And that gave him the unique perspective to truly understand what was so evil about Edom. And this is a powerful message that we'll see a little bit more in Rambam and his Mishnah Torah, is the idea that somebody who comes from a very dark place and can overcome it can understand that darkness perhaps better than anybody else and is uniquely qualified to be able to fight against it and to conquer it. So maybe Ovadiah didn't add any new facts to the story, but he added a very powerful perspective. So it's not necessarily what he said, it's who it was that said it. And it's almost raising him up as an example of somebody who can overcome such adversity. And Rambam in his Mishnah Torah, not specifically quoting Ovadiah, but clearly speaking about this idea about being surrounded by evil and going beyond it. Ken, if you would take for us the source from Rambam's Mishnah Torah, when he talks about, the different ways that people are, please.
It is human nature to be attracted to the ideas and actions of one's neighbors and friends, and to follow the customs of the people of his land. Therefore, a person needs to bind himself to the righteous and always dwell in the midst of the wise, in order that he may learn from their deeds and keep far from the evil ones who walk in darkness, so as not to learn from their deeds. And thus, if one lives in a land whose customs are evil and people who do not follow a straight path, one should go to a land where the people are righteous and are accustomed to following a good path. And if all the lands that he knows and hears reports of are accustomed to follow a path that is not good, like our time, or it is not possible to go to a land where people are accustomed to do good because of troops of health, he should remain alone by himself. And if they are evil and sinful people, do not allow him to stay there in the land unless he mixes amongst them and follows their evil way. He should go out to caves, thickets, and deserts. He shall not accustom himself to the ways of the sinners, as it says.
And I just cut it off there because it just brings a verse backing it up there, but it says the same thing. Is there's this idea among the rabbis, particularly in Pirkei Avot, they say that a person should actively surround themselves with wise people, with righteous, with good people. And this is consistent in the laws of gossip and speech, is surround yourselves with people who speak well, who speak kindness, and specifically distance yourself from sinners, from gossips, from people who will be a bad influence on you. That's great. That's the ideal. But it's not always possible. We're not always born in a place or in an opportunity where we can just choose to hang out with awesome, wonderful, positive people. And we don't always recognize it. If we are born amongst evil people who are corrupting, who are abusive, And that's all we know. We don't know there's anything better. Now, obviously, somebody who's born into a good family and raised to be good, they're a wonderful person. But the rabbis do say in the Talmud that nobody can stand in the place of a Baal Tshuva, somebody who has overcome their sins, overcome their evil nature, and become a good, righteous person. And there's this recognition that, yes, a good person is strong, but who is even stronger? Somebody who has overcome evil, somebody who has broken with their very nature. Think about how many, bad habits, whether it's bad eating or gossiping, we all have bad habits, and it's hard enough to change those subtle things. Imagine somebody who completely tries to change the very nature, who tries to completely separate themselves from their past and their family because they recognize how damaging it is. There's a story someone told me the other day of a rabbi who was speaking with someone who came to them and told them about their problems with their family and intermarriage and all these really big religious challenges. And the rabbi said to them, and I'm simplifying, missing parts of the story, he said, like, you are amazing. What do you mean, Rabbi? And he said, God gave you a challenge that only you could overcome. When you overcome this challenge, you will be far stronger. You'll be far greater than I could ever be. I couldn't handle something like that. And there's this recognition that the people who have to claw their way up, who have to face these incredible challenges and overcome them, they're far greater than us who, I don't want to say have it cushy, but don't have to face these challenges. So the reason we include the book of Ovadiah is not only because of the beautiful poetry, the succinctness and power of the message, but it's also a way to praise Ovadiah and say, Ovadiah, you overcome great adversity that many of us could never. You have a strength that none of us can imagine. You have a unique perspective of evil that none of us can understand. So you have something to add that Yirmiyahu could not. That, according to these sources, is why the book of Ovadiah is there. Not that it's completely unique in its message, but the messenger is unique and powerful and deserves to be praised for what he went through. That is the book of Ovadiah.